I don't want to take up more time than I have to. Maybe just very briefly. I mean, I was doing a doctoral dissertation on cooperation in economics and the lack of a logic of cooperation. And so that's I finished that, and now I've moved on to a postdoctoral position in Brussels and working on sustainable theory of the firm, seeing sustainability both in an ecological and a social sense. And I think a lot of the discussions we've been having here are very valid and very relevant in that context. So I'm taking a lot of notes, and I'm sure my reflections are not going to be as advanced or developed as Lucio's, just because I have not been dealing with these problems for as many years. Um, but anyway, so I just wanted to get directly into the um, discussion, and I saw that there's now an attempt to bridge this group into another discussion of cybernetics and social science, and I'm looking forward to that. And perhaps my contributions can maybe humbly serve as a bridge to some extent, more or less successfully. So just the basic, what I see is lessons and terms that we've been discussing and questions over the past few months. As I see it, Lucio in his book discusses sciento-technical evolution or revolution in terms of productivity or production, the mode of production, I guess as Marxists call it. You have this Luhmann and Habermas tension, or I guess you could call that systems thinking versus discourse ethics. And of course, on the left, you have here Habermas and Luhmann. And the question that he asks, of course, what is evolving in these types of social systems, saying that, or the answer being that it's the interaction of evolutionary logics and historical events, these notions of feedback versus feed forward, studying innovation systems, like in Italy, also this notion of that David Noble has of the directed evolution or of automation in production, these notions of synergy and redundancy, this contrast between dualistic and monadistic ways of thinking. And I think one of the lesser discussed topics has been this gap between what is called hard and soft cybernetics, which I'll get into later, in particular with respect to this discussion we just had on meaning. Klaus mentioned, I think that this graphic on page 101 is quite relevant there, contrasting Lutz's definition of the neo-evolutionary versus the institutional view. So maybe saving that discussion for later. Just a quick overview of what I'll say. So first, one of my major criticisms of the book is to what extent there can actually be what Weber calls a verstehende Soziologie, looking at bibliometrics and where that can go with respect to issues like climate and inequality, and then looking at some of the philosophical traditions, economy and what economics has to say, or maybe not has to say, ecology and some of the other, one might say social or complex sciences, and then a few reflections at the end. So to start with, Gouldner, I think his name is Alan, wrote an article in 1962 called Anti-Minotaur. On the left, of course, you see Theseus slaying the Minotaur, where he interprets the, I have to move this for a second, he interprets the belief in a value-free sociology as part of an ideology of a working group and from the standpoint of the sociology of occupations. And so seeing this as a minotaur, so to speak, the notion of value-freeness as a minotaur of the Bismarckian University and of Weber's own Protestantism. So, of course, this image can be used to refer to the mythological quality as well as the idea's ambiguity. So in 1913 work on Wissenschaft, Weber abruptly, and I'm quoting here from the text, mentions the problem of competition among professors for students. Weber notes that professors who do express a value stand are more likely to attract students than those who do not, and are therefore likely to have undue career advantages. Thus, Gouldner interprets Wertfreiheit as a kind of fair trades act to restrain competition. And he says this suggests that one of the latent functions of the value-free doctrine is to bring peace to the academic house by reducing competition for students, and in turn it directs us to, some of the institutional peculiarities of the German universities in Weber's time. Unlike the situation at the American university, career advancement in the German was then felt to depend too largely on the professor's popularity as a teacher. So also there's our reflections such as Hennes's with Weber's concern with the unconditionality, so-called, of the German university. Hennes actually was a sort of a discussant of Habermas's as well during the 1968 and subsequent era. And in an article he wrote with Ulrike and Roger Brisson, he says, above all, however, Weber made observations on the American universities during a trip there that had been shaped by a different and older tradition, developed entirely out of the confessional, in particular sect-bound colleges. The American universities had, unlike the German universities, rescued the original mission of education, this being the development of character, up to the present day. Weber never considered the unconditionality of German academic teaching as a special cultural achievement, but rather as a result of secularization and German poverty. In general, the situation had never permitted generous patronism and the founding of ideologically bound universities. So Weber's opinion of the character of German universities as state institutions, something that was not at all self-evident, had not only been shaped by this example, it was also influenced by the then current example of the founding of the Freie Universität in Amsterdam by Abraham Kuyper, who later became the Dutch prime minister. And Weber was particularly occupied by Kuyper's strictly Calvinist foundation, which was a university radically independent from the state. This was actually still possible. If one propagated one's own values on the lectern, then it was to be according to the Amsterdam model. So thus, Guldner concludes what to Weber was an agonizing expression of a highly personal faith, intensely felt and painstakingly argued, has today become a hollow catechism, a password, and a good excuse for no longer thinking seriously. So thus he concludes, if truth is the vital thing, as Weber is reputed to have said on his deathbed, that it must be all the truth we have to give as best we know it, being painfully aware and making our students aware that even as we offer it, we may be engaged in unwitting concealment rather than revelation. If we would teach students how science is made, really made, then rather as publicly reported, we cannot fail to expose them to the whole scientist by whom it is made, with all his gifts and blindnesses, with all his methods and his values as well. To do otherwise is to usher in an era of spiritless technicians who will be no less lacking in understanding than they are in passion, and who will be useful only because they can be used. So moving on to this foundation of bibliometrics, I found very interesting this whole discussion in the book and this whole discipline, which I did not know about. So this notion of a canon, I guess, a religious canon, I have a background in religious studies, and so I found this very interesting in this respect. Studies as well the history of origins of, say, sacred texts and similar. In this regard, Gregory Bateson, I know, speaks of the great chain of being, which he argues in a lecture in 1970 was inverted by Pythagoras. Looking at essences turned to looking at patterns. And in this regard, Bob Ulanovich, who is here today, talks as well in his book, The Third Window, about switching from the Eleatic to the Milesian school of thought, which I think is a very similar framing. And thus, Bateson suggests this chain was turned upside down, which is very significant considering that in this environment of looking at pattern, nothing, I guess this would be the zeros, becomes significant. And for Bateson, the example is a letter which never existed, say a letter to the Internal Revenue Service or the tax collectors, which may in fact, due to its absence, cause problems. So Lute observes that there is in fact variation in codes, and that there is no original text nowadays, and these variations alter meaning as well as information. And I think this relates to what Bateson calls the error in Darwinian theory, in which Bob writes of in the Third Window. And of course, Bateson called information news as well of a difference. So we see that as a phase transition, as Lute observes, from things like citations, then later on to hypertext. And, you know, coming from background as well in economics, you can apply this as well to things like money, which there is one reference in the text. I think that could be very interesting investigation there. I wanted to read a quote from Nietzsche here, which I find is very interesting in this regard, from the Genealogy of Morals, where he says the cause of the origin of a thing and its eventual utility, its actual employment and place in a system of purposes, lie worlds apart. Whatever exists, having somehow come into being, is again and again reinterpreted to new ends, taken over, transformed, and redirected by some power superior to it. All events in the organic world are a subduing and a becoming master, and all subduing and becoming master involves a fresh interpretation, an adjustment through which any previous meaning and purpose are necessarily obscured or even obliterated. However well one has understood the utility of a physiological organ and other things, legal institutions and so on, signs, this means nothing regarding its origin. Purposes and utilities are only signs that a will to power has become master of something less powerful and imposed upon it the character of a function, and the entire history of a thing, an organ, a custom, and so on, can in this way be a continuous sign chain of ever new interpretations and adaptations whose causes do not even have to be related to one another, but on the contrary, in some cases succeed and alternate with another on purely chance fashion. So it's a very interesting quote. Sorry, I'm talking so long. The evolution of a thing, a custom, and so on is thus by no means its progresses towards a goal, even less a logical progresses by the shortest route and with the smallest expenditure of force, but the succession of more or less profound, more or less mutually independent processes of subduing, plus the resistances they encounter, the attempts at transformation for the purpose of defense and reaction, and the results of successful counteractions. The form is fluid, but the meaning even more so. So I think this relates to a high degree to these discussions. But moving on, how can these methods and approaches actually serve in the context that we're living in today? And I think that one of the reflections that has to be made, as I was saying about Wertfreiheit, is that social systems involve power and they demand ethics, as research like that by Benjamin Page, Piketty, and many others has revealed. So we have things like the democratic deficit, deconsolidation, people are losing faith in democracy, things like climate change and catastrophe, inequality. And what Papa discussed about defending open society, the paradox of tolerance. And I, for my part, would refer to the notion of contested exchange by Herbert Gintis and Sam Bowles, which I find is a very fascinating model, looking at short side and long side interactions between agents. So again, looking at these edges rather than the nodes, where what's interesting here that it's asymmetrical and based on the number of desired interactions. Anyway, there's lots to say there, but also reflecting on the Argentine writer Ernesto Sabato's question of the role of the writer in a time of crisis. What is the role of academics? So I'm really breezing through a lot of stuff here. The tradition of phenomenology is alluded to, discussed, and very much integrated in a lot of what Lud is saying on the right here. Of course, you see Edmund Husserl. I think there's a lot to be said about Kant's contributions to this discourse, looking at his critical metaphysics, moving from his notion of pure reason, or his critique of pure reason rather, to the notion of aesthetic judgments, where Castoriadis, for instance, discussed the rise of the critique of judgment as a reaction to criticism of the first two, suggesting that a problem with the a priori approach to notions like the categorical imperative were present, and they were present almost immediately after publication. And so Kant spends much more time in his final critique in what he calls logical, intersubjective judgments, moving from phrases like that rose is beautiful to roses are beautiful. And I think this is a very valid framing or discourse in this respect. Looking at Hegel, his phenomenology of spirit, I think it's a very early attempt at a type of anticipatory system or systems theory. And in fact, I think it was influenced by Hegel's observations of the slave rebellion in Haiti, as Susan Buck-Morss has so cogently observed. Moving on to Husserl, his notions of subjectivity, intentionality, possibility, and reality. I think we could have an entire sort of course or reading a group on just these notions. And I see a little bit, maybe of a provocative statement here, two sort of progeny of these traditions today. You have Austrian economics with its notion of praxeology, a very subjectivist notion of value even, and of course the European existentialism of the 20th century, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who discussed the world as an objective fact, and in fact saw that Donald Landis observes about Merleau-Ponty that it is not simply the existence of others that becomes conceivable, it becomes manifest through the ways in which we make sense of each other and relate to each other. Language, and especially dialogue, has a special role here, for in dialogue we coexist through a common world, and Merleau-Ponty rejects the Sartrean thesis that being for others is the experience of inescapable master-slave conflict as subjects dominate each other. And Merleau-Ponty himself observes that the civilization in which I play my part exists for me in a self-evident way in the implements with which it provides itself in his objective spirit, which of course again reminds of Hegel and these similar discussions. So Luth brings in the notion of interobjectivity, which I think is a very interesting concept that continually recurs throughout the book, that I think connects with both communications and organizational theory. And retains some notion of the separation of res cogitans and res extensas, although while Descartes has a distinction between mind and matter, and we get a distinction between individual consciousness and communication. And one could apply this type of thinking to notions like the differential risk profiles regarding or respective to class. And people say, why are working class people less entrepreneurial? These might be, again, experiential artifacts, so to speak. Anyway, lots to say there. Looking at economics as well, it has been said and has been observed that economics has historically lacked a evolutionary framework. And even though Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand and similar concepts can be viewed as dynamic concepts, they fail to integrate a dynamic conception of communicative acts, new goal functions that could be followed besides things like following self-interest. Moreover, the two most important failures of Adam Smith were his failure to deal with the issue of slavery in a systematic way, failing to ignore or rather failing to consider the impact of this regime on both communicative and actual acts. His teleological interpretation of the propensity to truck, barter, and trade as a human nature, which naturalizes markets, turning a phenotype into a genotype, following Lutz's dictum. And there are criticisms of Nelson and Winter. I know Lucio has also criticized them as well. And Luth correctly points out the frequent exogeneity of evolutionary economists discussing innovation. But beyond questions of endo or exogeneity, there are questions of technological ambiguity. Back on the level of meaning, technology, of course, is not neutral, as has been pointed out by many, many authors: Marx, Norbert Wiener, David Noble, Theodor Rosek, many others. These structural holes among triads, also very interesting concept that reminds me of Robert Aumann's criticisms of game theory. Aumann, of course, suggested that it was very odd that in spite of the long history of the theory of subjective probability, nobody seems to have examined the consequence of basing mixed, or what he calls mixed strategies, on subjective random devices. Doing so, he argues, gets some startling results, including the fact that two-person zero-sum games lose their strictly competitive character, and it becomes worthwhile to cooperate in such games, entering into binding agreements. And of course, he expands this into three and more person situations. And the point being that the way that individuals relate to each other matters. So there should be a way to endogenize these selection mechanisms. I think this is an appeal that Luth makes throughout the book. I refer here to Cockshott, Paul Cockshot's reopening of what was called the socialist calculation debate about 100 years ago. And Cockshott, of course, has been instrumental in revealing some of the errors in past arguments, such as Hayek's focus on price mechanisms, suggesting that the planned economy would allow for turnpike algorithms based on quantity reactions. And he's forcefully argued that, contrary to Hayek's claims, the amount of information that would have to be transmitted in a planned system is substantially lower than that for a market system. The centralized gathering of information is less onerous than the commercial correspondence required by the market. Hayek's error comes from focusing on the price channel to the exclusion of the quantity channel. In addition, the conversion time of the market system is slower, argues Cockshott. Also, I would mention network economics here on the left, the graphic, of course, moving from the wealth of nations to the wealth of networks. We have people like Yoshai Benkler, who's talked about non-market production, looking at examples like Wikipedia, Linux, other things. I'm speaking to you from the Linux system here. And Benkler has come up with notions like commons-based peer production, discussing and extending Elinor Ostrom's concepts and discussing the fact that we use the internet to keep in touch with family and intimate friends, both geographically proximate and distant. To the extent we do see that shift in social ties, it is because, in addition to strengthening our strong bonds, we are also increasing the range and diversity of weaker connections. Now getting into Bob's area here of ecology and biology, other similar sciences. I mentioned to you, Bob, this observation by Marvin Brown of the relation between ecology and economy. Ecology, of course, a much more recent science. They have the same root, the oikos, the household. Of course, ecology having the logos, which refers to, I guess, the understanding, and economy, the nomos, which is managing. And Brown suggests that it doesn't make any sense to manage something without understanding it. So these two sciences naturally belong together. And Bob, of course, has also called for a non-reductionist view that sees the tensions between synergy and redundancy, similarly to how Lute describes them. And in fact, I find very similar sort of epistemic framing in these two concepts, contrasting notions of ascendancy and overhead in Bob's work. Uh, and I think that these have been compared by Bob to the Hegelian dialectic. And I don't have time to really to get into the similarities, but I think this is really worth of the sort of the discussion. So how can these two perspectives, particularly Bob's third window, how can these two books converse with each other? Notions of efficiency and resilience. Uh, I can't really get into the details here, maybe in the discussion. Um, I think what's also really interesting in terms of self-organization is the history of studying reciprocity in nature and also in society. There's lots to be said there, from Darwin, among others, to Kropotkin, who's discussed the evolution of ethics, Marcel Mauss, many, many others. Just one example, we have the Preference Network, which was started by the MacArthur Foundation in the 1990s. People like Joe Henrich, Sam Bowles, Herb Gintis have been trying to discuss and find out about the origins of social preferences and other things, and to inject these back into social sciences. Uh, of course, a recent example has been made by David Graeber and Wengrow, who just put out a book, the late David Graeber, suggesting an indigenous critique to the traditional reading of the European Enlightenment and social theories such as Rousseau's and Hobbes. Um, Lots to be said, of course, there as well. And there's also discussions about niches and how the spread of new types of selection mechanisms can actually evolve. As well, here on the right, there's a picture from a recent article from Nature by Amy Way and others, suggesting interesting interactions between social networking and climate change as catalysts for technological innovations. It is likely that markets, as we understand them today, had little to do in such transformations. And thus, we should remind ourselves of Karl Polanyi's important contribution to economic anthropology in works like Economy as Instituted Process, where he suggested that markets were just one form of integration among three main ones. There's exchange, reciprocity, and redistribution. Thus, the spread of technology may have more to do with reciprocity than with trucking and bartering, in Adam Smith's dictum. So anyhow, what to do now? I think, well, in addition to leading this discussion in the next group on social sciences and cybernetics, I think there is a need to find paths to bring cybernetics and complexity to contemporary both academic and social debates. We've talked about finding a lexicon and translating shared perspectives across disciplinary boundaries. I'm very enamored by Herbert Gintis's attempt to develop such a lexicon. Of course, his consists of gene cultural evolution, the socio-psychological theory of norms, game theory, the rational actor model, and complexity theory. It's arguable whether that's the mix, but perhaps that's one view. And I think all of this is essential for influencing beyond what Ludwig Fleck calls esoteric thought collectives and spreading, so to speak, the gospel or the message. Of course, also conversing with and addressing critical evolutionary logics like climate change and inequality. Of course, the Club of Rome was very pivotal in that regard. And I think creating, also is important, creating pedagogical programs that are cost effective and accessible in the Global South particularly. And one model could be the Finnish Team Academy, which has spread since to Mondragon in Spain and offers courses for as low as 20 euros. And again, reminding ourselves that education has more purposes than just novelty production, also looking at the human factor and this notion of the moral economy of the crowd, or double movements and people's ability to self-organize to meet certain ends. One notion I wanted to just in closing emphasize, which I have not seen discussed here at all, and I would be interested to hear what others have to say here, is this contestation between Bayesian and frequentist statistics. And returning to that tension between monadism and dualism, this tension can also be found at the root of modern science in statistics. And Kaplan, statistician, suggests that a frequentist framework actually, on the one hand, views probability as synonymous with long-run frequency, and the infinitely repeated coin toss represents the canonical example of the frequentist view. All of frequentist statistical practice derives from the notion of probability as long-run frequency, and it employs concepts like the law of large numbers and similar things. On the other hand, the Bayesian view is summarized by the idea that was expressed provocatively by De Finetti: probability does not exist, an aphoristic and laconic way of expressing the idea that probability does not have an objective status, but rather represents the quantification of our experience of uncertainty. Thus, the notion of probability as something external to the individual possessing an objective status out there is superstition no different from postulating the existence of cosmic ether, absolute space and time, or fairies and witches. And so the curious contestation between these two versions of the sort of foundations of scientific practices, I think, is a discussion that needs to be had. Offering notions like causal inference that harnesses graph theory. Lucio was applying some of these observations, or these, I guess, methods in his prior talk towards making causal predictions, which can include anticipation. And again, looking at alternative selection mechanisms, we have market, commons, and civil society, private value, public value, and notions of transparency. Also, Vasilis Kostakis has a notion of light, medium, and heavy, referring to technology. So I think I will skip this because this refers to some of the things that Lucio has discussed. For instance, here I say that it's not only significant who published with whom, but also who financed, to whom funders and researchers are accountable. And maybe just this very last point of the necessity for elevating soft cybernetics to its rightful places. Magnus Ramage, I invited, I don't think he came, has written a compelling essay entitled Norbert and Gregory, Two Strands of Cybernetics, focusing on the history and development of particularly second-order cybernetics in the personality and biography of two of its most central contributors, Norbert Wiener and Gregory Bateson. He argues that the two streams can be distinguished most readily by their treatment of information. While Wiener saw information as something separate from its sender, receiver, or intended meaning, in Bateson's version, information exists only when the two levels of difference have been fulfilled. There must be a difference from the existing state, a change in the environment, but there must also be a difference in the perception of someone who is attributing meaning to the first level of difference. Thus, for Bateson, information is inexorably bound up with mental processes. And so there are lots of examples of people using these sort of triple helix or quintuple helix notions. Here, there's one on the right from the city of Valencia, which is adopting its mission Valencia 2030, together with Mariana Mazzucato and her department there, which the mission serves as a framework to bring together stakeholders who are the helixes here. And in this case, actually, it's very interesting that that the mission actually provides some very positive and negative feedback, in the sense that it brought together many stakeholders and was therefore very much more resilient than had one had, say, a cadre of very so say opinionated individuals in the city council. On the other hand, it led to some watering down of the mission based on the fact that one had to incorporate the views of all of the city council. Just wrapping up here, I think this is the second to last slide. I think it's very important to look at the impact of vision and what Castoriadis calls imaginary, and on this notion of hyperincursivity. And I think they can replace them in a sense where one can model the spatial and the temporal reconstructions that operate actually on each other. And I think that missions in this sense can operate as a type of a vision, and they could be reframed as hyper-incursive counterfactuals following Pearl's notion of causal inference. And examples of these could be the One China policy as implemented by China with respect to Taiwan and other entities, the Marshall Plan in Europe after the war, Mark Zuckerberg on the left here and his notion of the metaverse. And of course, these entail very important ethical dilemmas and discursive elements that we could talk about. So I think that this triple helix or n-tuple helix framework does provide an epistemic framework for embedding communications within political economy. Cybernetics more generally allows moving beyond traditional dichotomies between res cogitans and res extensa without abandoning dualism. And I do agree that communication is the missing link between things like game theory, decision theory, and organization, which I think has been missed by organizational research. And I think questions do remain whether information is a quasi-physical object, as Wiener has argued, or a process, as Bateson has argued. Maybe this is a simplification. And one question is, can anticipatory reflections be turned to the future as a comparative futurology, or does the owl of Minerva only fly at midnight? And of course, questions on the selection mechanisms, the role of law, heterarchy versus hierarchy. And maybe if you'll allow me one last statement here. I'm reading here from the book. Lute says that since selection is deterministic, selection mechanisms determine what in the variation can be considered as a signal and what as noise. In my opinion, says Lute, the specification of these selection mechanisms as hypotheses has theoretical priority. Thus, I believe the most valuable contribution of the book is the distinction between the institutional, on the one hand, and the neo-evolutionary models on the other. And Lute suggests they operate at different levels with different foci, giving us a choice as to which elements we emphasize, much as Einstein's theory of relativity gave us a choice as to viewing light as a particle or wave. The question, I think, is not which perspective is right, but pragmatically speaking, which offers us the most insight into solving pressing problems of the day. And answering this question, I think, requires abandoning Wertfreiheit. So neuroscientists and behavioral scientists are confirming every day that emotions and values are what make us distinctly human, and therefore bracketing out our own values, even as scientists, seems to me to lead to a disingenuous science, which particularly Margareta has critiqued in her work. I think we need Werte now more than ever. So that's it for me.